Yeah, that was wonderful. Now I have to launch into a new panel, but I'm still thinking about so many of these themes, and we don't know each other, but shared many of your experiences. So that's really wonderful. Okay, so I have the pleasure of chairing a really exciting panel, Thinking with and Against Hannah Arendt. This, I think, is so much at the heart of any conference that celebrates Sheila Ben Habib. So, I'm not going to say too much, but obviously Sheila's work has been so influential in the field of Hannah Arendt studies, and they've really changed over the years. And her students are, the top scholars of Hannah Arendt around the world. And so, you've really done so much to bring Arendtian political theory into the field. And I think it has changed critical theory, and I think it's changed political theory as a whole. And so I'm just really excited to introduce the panelists who are going to tell us a little bit more about, where Arendt studies are headed now, today. So here, I want to, the other thing is that I know we have new viewers who've come in over the course of the day. So I also just wanted to say welcome to anybody who has, logged on in the last hour or two to this conference in celebration of the work of Sheila Ben Habib. Because we have new people who probably logged on, I'm going to hand it over very quickly to Nika Siegel, who's going to explain how the question and answer works through Zoom so that everybody's on the same page. Okay, Nika, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Anna. Again, just really quickly, welcome to all of you who are just joining us. So my role is just to explain our Q&A procedure. Even though we're online, we'd like to foster as much back and forth and discussion as we can. So for those of you in the audience, if you go down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a Q&A function, and you can click on it and pose your question. If you're a panelist that's just joining us, you're welcome to use the chat for the same function. We'll be sorting through questions in real time to try to get a nice distribution of questions from different perspectives. And in most cases, we'll be able to call on you to ask your question, although depending on the influx, we may also pose them, the chair may pose them herself. We would really encourage you to ask your questions as they occur to you in real time, because it will help us to imagine what kind of conversation we can foster. So please use it liberally, and looking forward to the discussion. So back to Anna.
Great. Oh, and I forgot to introduce myself because I realize not everybody knows me. I'm Anna Yurkiewicz, and I'm an assistant professor of political science at University of British Columbia, so coming to you from Vancouver. And then one more thing I want to say before we begin is that if anybody out there in the audience, outside of our panelists especially, is interested in making a toast during the reception, which is from 5:15 to 6 p.m., please let us know through the chat or Q&A functions, and the organizers will let us know. Okay, all right, so to our panel. What I'm going to do is introduce each panelist right before they speak. We have 5 panelists today, so I'm just going to get us started right away. Our first panelist today is Sonali Chakravarti. She's an associate professor of government at Wesleyan University, and she's going to be speaking to us about the enigma of the perpetrator, Ayman Anwar, and the possibilities of reenactment. So take it away, Sonali.
Thanks very much. I'm happy to be here. I wanted to share my screen briefly. Okay. The enigma of the perpetrator, Ayman Anwar, and the possibilities of reenactment. Hannah Arendt did not travel to Jerusalem in 1961 because she wanted confirmation of her impressions of Nazi officers or because of the self-satisfaction she might experience through moral condemnation of Eichmann. Neither of these held any interest for her. Rather, she made the trip to witness the particularity of Eichmann's performance on the legal stage. It was an opportunity to be face to face with an agent of genocide in a storied hall of justice. Yet the insights into Adolf Eichmann's psyche and motivation were difficult for Arendt to access in the context of a legal trial, and her engagement with them made up some of her most controversial claims in Eichmann in Jerusalem. In this presentation, I will suggest that what Arendt wished she could have learned about Eichmann was, in important ways, revealed through the reenactments of Anwar Congo, the character at the center of Joshua Oppenheimer's remarkable 2012 documentary, The Act of Killing. Arendt notes during the trial, Eichmann spoke in cliches, seemed to lack the enlarged mentality that would allow him to empathize with victims, and he resisted any form of remorse or reckoning. Each of these observations is upturned by Anwar's actions over the course of the documentary. Furthermore, I will argue that the act of killing allows for Arendt's and Bettina Stagnit's findings to exist together in a way that evokes Sheila Ben Habib's question, but can Eichmann not be a convinced Nazi anti-Semite and also banal? The documentary, in an affecting way, shows how these two understandings of a perpetrator can coexist in someone who is both deeply ideologically motivated to kill, but also displays mundane tendencies to narcissism and self-glorification. Lastly, I will consider whether the documentary represents a type of Faustian bargain. That is, the promise of access to the psychic life of a perpetrator only if there is a friendship between the interlocutor and the perpetrator and there is no threat of punishment. Nominated for an Academy Award, The Act of Killing follows Anwar Congo and a group of his associates who participated in the 1965-66 state-sanctioned killings of communists and Indonesians of Chinese descent. With the knowledge and tacit support of the US, President Suharto oversaw the campaign in which over 1 million Indonesians were killed. In his documentary, Oppenheimer invites Anwar and his friends to make a film about their experiences as, quote, gangsters, thugs for hire who carried out the regime's genocidal campaign while becoming notorious in their neighborhoods and in the country. With the assistance of Oppenheimer, the participants scripted and produced set pieces in a variety of genres, Western, film noir, war film, etc., that referred to different types of violence they had committed. They depicted interrogations and murders in a newspaper office, a village, and in private homes, staging each scene as accurately as they could. They also directed and performed a fantasy sequence, complete with waterfalls and a giant fish, set to the song Born Free, the popular song from 1966, that is also a reference to the translation they gave of the word gangster as free men. Now I want to show a few stills from the film. Here we see Anwar on the right having stage makeup put on when he's going to be playing a victim in one of the scenes. He also enacts the role of the perpetrator, which he was in 1965-66. Here we see a reenactment in a village scene where Anwar is the man with the helmet in the back. Here is a reenactment of a scene of pillaging and looting a village, and you can see that this is taken from the film, and you see the words "cut, cut, cut" on the bottom. The Anwar giving direction about the filming of the process, and so locals were asked to play the villagers during these scenes. And here is Anwar Congo watching the film of his reenactment with his grandchildren. I'll be talking about this very critical moment where the filmmaker is there and the filmmaker thinks that the film is too violent for the grandchildren, but he says, no, I want them to see it. And he is able to put himself in the perspective, see himself through the perspective of the victim at that moment. And then lastly, this is a scene from the fantasy sequence where Anwar and other perpetrators envision meeting victims in heaven and what victims might say to them. From the start, Arendt's observations in Eichmann in Jerusalem show that she is aware that many aspects of Eichmann's personality and motivation cannot be revealed in the scope of the trial, because they fit neither the prosecution's motive for highlighting the suffering of Holocaust victims, nor Eichmann's strategy to make it seem that he was nothing more than a good soldier for his commander. Both Arendt and Stagnith note how routinized lying was for Eichmann, further obfuscating access to his motivations and inner life. Here, Stagnath describes how critical lying was for Eichmann's sense of power. Stagnath writes, if you make someone believe a lie, you have power over him or her. The liar is given the power to rebuild the world around us, and we operate according to his or her rules. If you read Eichmann's notes written in his cell, you can find hints that Eichmann savored this special feeling of power, even as an accused. Eichmann's lying and his sense that it was the source of his power provides another interesting parallel with Oppenheimer's strategy of attempting to access Anwar's inner life through his creative choices for the film. Directing and staging in his own production allowed Anwar to put forth another type of lie, that is a lie of the cinema, and he took pleasure, as Eichmann did, in rebuilding a world around him according to his own wishes. Juxtaposing Anwar's directorial choices with the deception Eichmann uses as a matter of course, leads to the possibility that it is the true lie, the one that captures the motivation and self-delusions of perpetrators as they themselves define it, that may be the most useful way to assess the contours of the psychological motivation of perpetrators. Arendt's frustrations with Eichmann's cliches, the epitome of thoughtless speech, evokes another way in which she is perhaps subconsciously drawn to what reenactment might provide. She notes in Eichmann, quote, the manifest shallowness in the doer that made it impossible to trace the incontestable evil of his deed to any deeper level. Yet, if one primarily focuses on the doing, that is the actions of the perpetrator, without looking for evidence of a deeper evil, new lines of inquiry may be opened up. The cliches evoked by Eichmann provided him with a shorthand way to, one, evoke universalism for the purpose of his defense, and two, avoid the present inquiry through deflection into prepackaged thoughts, the substance of which Arendt found thoroughly disheartening. In contrast, reenactment with its reliance on bodily and physical memory cannot be reduced to cliche. Seeing the swiftness and ease of Anwar's bodily movements during the reenactments provides evidence of his guilt that stands in sharp contrast to the evasions and denials of direct responsibility at the Eichmann trial. It feels fitting that 20 years into the 21st century, it is not the newness of an international tribunal like Nuremberg or a truth commission like the South African one that provide an intervention into thinking about the role of perpetrators in public life. Rather, we can now appreciate a strategy of distraction and reenactment as a way to understand the mechanisms of violence and augment the historical record. One of Arendt's most critical observations is that Eichmann showed no capacity for an enlarged mentality. In contrast, Anwar in the film was not asked to describe how the victim must have felt. He was asked to embody it through drawing on the movements, gestures, and utterances he remembered from 1965. In doing so, he was accessing what Sheila Ben Habib has called the particularized and concrete other, when the language of the generalized other was not ethically available to him. The verisimilitude that Anwar was so eager to capture as an auteur filmmaker became the path to understanding the perspective of a victim. In a role reversal, he played the victim in an interrogation scene at a newspaper office. When the intimidation and threats by the aggressor become too much for him to bear, he calls for the scene to be cut short, visibly shaken. We see that the others on the soundstage offer him water and try to bring his focus back to the artificial elements of that experience. Later, when showing the scene to his grandson, he is again emotionally affected by the scene, but is now able to put into words what he is thinking. So Anwar says, did the people I tortured feel the way I do here? He speculates. I can feel what the people I tortured felt. Oppenheimer then challenges him in a way that is unusual for the film. Oppenheimer says, actually, the people you tortured felt far worse because you know it's only a film. They know they were being killed. Congo breaks down and pleads with Oppenheimer. But I can feel it, Josh. Really, I can feel it. Or have I sinned? I did this to so many people, Josh. Is it all coming back to me? I really hope it won't. I don't want it to, Josh. This exchange is remarkable because it is at once the type of realization that the audience is hoping for from Anwar and simultaneously dependent on the constructed encounter that Oppenheimer has facilitated. Josh engaged with Anwar as a flawed human being, one worthy of attention and care, and this leads to a space where Anwar could grapple with conflicting feelings of guilt, fear of reprisal, and sadness. The intimacy of the moment as Anwar is watching a video at home with his grandsons is in stark opposition to the formality of Eichmann in the glass box. The stakes are entirely different, and so is the potential for an enlarged mentality. While Arendt would not have wanted to give up the opportunity for punishment to get the candor that Anwar displays here, she was attuned to her humanistic desire to hear it. Ben Habib's intervention on behalf of particularized thinking as a way to account for the humanity of all subjects is also useful for thinking about what it means to consider the humanity of the perpetrator. Just as Arendt saw the danger of ignoring the concrete particulars of perpetrators as a shallow retreat into a condemnation of evil, Oppenheimer also considered hasty judgment of the gangsters as a failure of his own curiosity. If we consider Anwar and Eichmann to be concrete others who are looking for fame, stature, and meaning in their particularity, we may be able to imagine other paths they may have taken. In conclusion, the relationship between access to the psychic lives of perpetrators as evident in Arendt's reportage, Stagnant's research, and Oppenheimer's collaboration does not supplant the work of judgment. While a more expansive understanding of the life conditions and motivations that lead a person to violence may elicit mercy in some cases, in many others it will not. It may, however, lend even greater gravitas to the act of judging, highlighting it as a distinctive form of thinking that requires the ability to move between concrete particulars and abstract categories, and to enable what Weber refers to as the differentiation of value spheres. While reenactment is essentially a type of aesthetic endeavor, both for the actor and the audience, the work of legal judgment has different ends. Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem was a lightning rod for controversy because Arendt refused to think narrowly about Eichmann or the Nazis. Her argument was a larger one about bureaucracy and the state. Appreciating what the reenactments of the act of killing can show us about the motivations of perpetrators complements Arendt's larger project in meaningful ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonali. That was really fascinating. I have to see this film now. Okay, and so also to the other panelists, I'm going to send you my message. I should have said something before. I'll send you a little 2-minute message and a wrap it up message through the chat function. So you'll see, when you see a little pop up, that means you're getting a warning. Okay, so let's move on to Gaia Demirol, who is an assistant professor of political theory at Bogazici. Okay, you're gonna do it better. Bogazici, I think, University in Istanbul, who's gonna talk about truth telling as world building, and she's also gonna correct my pronunciation before she gets going.
Thank you. It's Bogazici University. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity to celebrate Sheila Ben Habib's work and mentorship. Today, I'd like to offer some theoretical reflections driven by an embedded and pressing political reality and lived experience, something I've learned from Hannah Arendt by way of Sheila Ben Habib. So in my remarks today, I would like to talk about truth, more precisely factual truth. In our polarized contemporary societies, truth is more relevant and contested than ever. It was only in 2016 that Oxford Dictionary chose post-truth as the word of the year. Since 2018, political commentators have been referring to the rise of post-truth politics around the world, US, UK, India, Brazil, and even in Russia and China. So in my remarks, I will look at political relevance of truth. What is the political nature of truth-telling, and how can we protect truth? To answer these questions, I turn to Hannah Arendt. Arendt is first and foremost a theorist of action. She believes in the sphere of political activity, of the public realm in which we come together to change the world. But this sphere is limited by a world of things, a world of facts. There would be no permanence, no stability, no perseverance in human existence, Arendt says, without people willing to testify to what is. So truth has a world constitutive quality, according to Arendt. Truth is what we cannot change. Quote, "It is the ground on which we stand and the sky that stretches above us." The attack on truth is therefore an attack on our political community, our common world. My remarks will be primarily based on Arendt's twin articles, Truth and Politics of 1967 and Lying in Politics of 1971, where she specifically takes up the question of truth. Following Arendt, I want to start with the observation that truth is both very powerful and at the same time very fragile. How is truth powerful? Arendt says there is a coercive element in factual truth. Facts have no conclusive reason for being what they are. They are a kind of contingency. Facts are not there to fit into a greater narrative. There is no meaning in factuality. But this is precisely the price of freedom, according to Arendt, a sense of it might have been otherwise. But this is also why lies are more tempting and more believable. The liar has the great advantage of knowing beforehand what the audience wants to hear. The lies, therefore, fit better into a narrative that we already have in our minds. Lie is easy, comforting. The lie doesn't shock us. It doesn't expect us to reason or judge. It is in line with our expectations, beliefs, ideologies. On the contrary, factual truth is shocking, unexpected. Factual truth is hard to handle. But to recognize things for what they are for Arendt is necessary to understand them, to stand up to them, and eventually to change them. Facts, on the other hand, are fragile. They do not have weight in and of themselves. They need to be witnessed, to be seen, heard, and communicated to others. Facts, in other words, need testimony, as Arendt would say, quote, to find a secure dwelling place in the domain of human affairs. Facts need the willingness of individuals to step into the light of the public with their testimony. It needs their courage. It needs their trustworthiness. What is the status of factual truth in contemporary society? In the contemporary world, factual truth is under two different kinds of attack. First, truth, especially unwelcome factual truth, risks being discredited by being reduced to mere opinion. This is actually Arendt's incredibly foresightful diagnosis of the post-truth society, even before it was a thing. In the modern world, factual truth is countered not by outright lies, but by opinion. Fact becomes one opinion among others, and it seems to me. When facts are reduced to opinion, they're especially vulnerable to be discredited, overlooked, ignored, and forgotten. Second, it is under systematic attack by political leaders who need to erase or manipulate its factual truth to neutralize opposition, suppress dissent, increase their popularity among their supporters, and consolidate their power. The second attack is not unrelated to the first one. Under these conditions, can truth be covered up indefinitely? Is there a limit to how effectively truth can be manipulated, obfuscated, eradicated? Arendt oscillates between hope and fear. Sometimes she says it's not completely outside the realm of possibilities that a political system can be omnipotent. At other times, she says lying can never be total. I think she points to a few non-systematic reasons. The first reason has to do with the fact that factual truth is in the past and therefore has grown into a dimension beyond our reach. The second reason is expressed in the form of a mind-body problem. Arendt seems to be saying that truth always catches up with you because you can remove your mind from the circumstances, but you cannot remove your body. A kind of sober realism about the physical reality of factual circumstances. Thirdly, covering the truth completely and indefinitely requires a lot of effort. No government is omnipotent that way. And at the end of the day, organized lying requires a level of omnipotence, that nobody possesses. But Arendt herself makes the counterpoint to this argument in The Origins of Totalitarianism. Nazis believed that, quote, all Jews are beggars without passports, unquote, and then they made sure to alter the existing laws to strip Jews of their income, wealth, and citizenships. Another example that Arendt likes to use is that Lenin managed to erase Trotsky out of the books and out of the revolution. So at the end of the day, does the prospect for truth depend on the state's capacity or lack thereof? If you look at these three ideas together, Arendt seems to be saying that eventually, in the long run, truth will come out. But then is it a matter of time horizons? If that's the case, then in the meantime, the damage done is real. A fourth reason goes something like this. For lies to work, you need to first be clear on the facts. The efficiency of the lie depends on a clear notion of the truth that the liar wishes to hide. But in organized lying, liars themselves can no longer remember the truth behind their concealments. They believe their own lies to such an extent that they cannot remember what it was that they were trying to hide in the first place. She has an interesting observation about lie. Lie tears a hole in the fabric of factuality, but an attentive eye can recognize lies by the incongruity, the patched-up places, if you will. If the fabric is intact, the lie will show. The modern lies, however, are so big that they require a rearrangement of the whole factual texture. This means that those who come up with these lies need to convince themselves of their veracity first. The line between deception and self-deception disappears. The whole fabric of our reality becomes a lie. When this happens, the insider who refuses to buy into it becomes the bigger enemy, like journalists, academics, human rights activists, anyone who displays the slightest amount of skepticism. Arendt says, therefore, that there will always be a time when lying becomes unsustainable and counterproductive. But what does it mean for lies to be counterproductive? They confuse people without convincing them. Well, why is this necessarily counterproductive? Sometimes liars benefit precisely from this confusion, which contributes to eroding the line between truth and non-truth. Then there is a whole issue of ignorance. A big ally of those of the organized lie is the ordinary people, those who remain ignorant of the facts, those who choose to remain satisfied with the information they receive on their social life. There's a dangerous complicity here. Finally, who is the guarantor of truth? The fragility of the facts reminds us of the necessity of free public space, discussion, and the right to be informed. Arendt points towards the free press, the judiciary, and the universities as the guardians of the truth. The chances for truth to prevail in public greatly improves by the existence of independent institutions that find out, stand guard over, and interpret factual truth. Therefore, the free press, academia, and the judiciary are under such fiery attack in our countries, particularly in authoritarian ones. In her reflections on Pentagon Papers, Arendt says that this happened in a free country where all kinds of information were available, and that seems to be a very important qualification. In a place like the US, hopefully, we can still turn to the better side of the country, the institutions. But what happens in not so free countries? What hope is there for countries where the foundations of institutions have not been laid securely to begin with? There is one final sliver of hope, and that is a group of people who would not be intimidated by the government and would rather go to jail. And this brings me to a final question. Is there ever an action-like quality to truth? Can truth-telling ever become an action? When organized lying has become the ruling principle of a country, then truth-telling becomes a force, hence a political factor. Where everybody lies, truth-telling becomes an action for changing the world, reminiscent of the children's story, Emperor's New Clothes. Of course, we are indebted to these heroic individuals who stand up for what is right, what simply is. They risk their jobs, they risk their reputations, livelihood, freedom, and even their lives, and we are grateful. But isn't this a too high price to pay? More importantly, their heroic efforts do not change the fact that lying and manipulation threatens the very nature of our political communities. Arendt argues that we might see the facts in a different light, and we are even free to arrange the facts to our liking, which is why conspiracy theories are so popular after all. But we must first be able to agree on the facticity of the facts. Even for those who do not believe in organized lie, the outcome, therefore, is a peculiar kind of cynicism, a disbelief toward any news or information. With the destruction of the facts, we are destroying that sense by which we take our bearing in the world, our ability and willingness to tell right from wrong, truth from fact. The attack on our community, the attack on our truth in our contemporary world, therefore, I want to claim, is an attack on our political community, on our common world. When we lose this common ground, we are fractured, divided, polarized, not a community anymore. And this is something we very much acutely feel in Turkey, but those of you in the US perhaps feel it as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gaia. Okay, next up we have, we have Ayten Gündoğdu, who is the Tow Associate Professor of Political Science at Barnard, and she's going to talk to us about a critical phenomenology of border deaths. Thank you, Ayten.
Thank you, Anna. I'm delighted and honored to be part of this celebration of Sheila Ben-Habib's work, and I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this conversation. I'm a political theorist born and raised in Istanbul, Turkey, working and residing in the US. And I work on human rights, migration, international law, and the political thought of Hannah Arendt. As you can imagine, that personal background combined with my research interests often gives rise to the question of whether I was a student of Professor Ben-Habib. While I was not formally a student of Professor Ben-Habib, I consider myself fortunate to encounter her work very early in my intellectual life as an undergraduate student at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. And that encounter left its mark on my scholarly trajectory as a political theorist in significant ways. This panel invites us to engage in thinking with Arendt against Arendt, which is the interpretive approach that Sheila Ben-Habib introduces in The Reluctant Modernism of Hannah Arendt, where she offers us two key reasons for this approach. First and foremost, Arendt's corpus is not a finished closed system, but rather a force field created by interpretive tensions, to borrow a phrase that Ben-Habib uses to characterize her own work. Second, thinking with Arendt against Arendt is necessary when the interpreter grapples with Arendt's key concepts and arguments in the face of challenging contemporary phenomena, such as the new constellations of statelessness examined by Ben-Habib for the past 20 years. In this paper, I hope to put into practice such an interpretive approach, as I call from Arendt's work some fragments that can provide us with crucial insights into one of the pressing contemporary problems of rightlessness, the increasing numbers of migrant deaths, especially in the Euro-Mediterranean region. According to a recent estimate provided by the International Organization for Migration, at least 60,000 migrants have died as they tried to cross borders since the year 2000. Even this very conservative estimate should give us pause. And what is more troubling is the fact that there is an international regime of impunity surrounding these deaths. States that routinely adopt border policies that deliberately expose migrants to death and injury have so far remained unaccountable for their actions. In my current work on this problem, I critically examine this regime of impunity by rethinking migrant deaths as forced disappearances, or as practices that push migrants beyond the pale of the law, make it difficult to locate their whereabouts, and render their lives disposable. As I adopt this term from international human rights law in order to understand migrant deaths as state crimes, I also take into account its phenomenological resonances to attend to various forms of legal, political, and social non-recognition that attend migrant deaths, including the lack of any systematic effort to recover remains, identify the dead, inform families, and have proper burials. Rethinking migrant deaths as forced disappearances urges us to grapple with the difficult question of how other persons become visible to us or cease to be visible to us, to quote Elaine Scarry. How does someone cease to appear as a living being with whom we share the world as equals? Through what kinds of processes do we fail to apprehend their killing as murder? Why are their bodies treated as inanimate things stripped of rights after death? What kinds of perceptual shifts are necessary to change this taken for granted background and open up new ways of perceiving and acknowledging life and death? Similar questions have led scholars working on migrant deaths to the work of Judith Butler, particularly to her concept of precariousness, in order to examine how borders render migrants' lives superfluous and their deaths ungrievable. Yet, Butler's distinct understanding of this term as an existential condition arising from the finitude of life, bodily vulnerability, and radical exposure to others risks turning sociopolitical dynamics of precarity into secondary factors arising from a primary condition of life itself, as several critics have already emphasized. When applied to migrant deaths, an ontologized account of precariousness, along with an overemphasis on loss and mourning, risks obscuring how border enforcement operates in a racialized manner by relegating racial others to a condition of rightlessness, expelling them from the world of the living, and justifying their annihilation with impunity. To attend to precisely these problems, I try to put phenomenology into conversation with critical theory, particularly critical race theory and critical legal studies. I integrate Butler's own analysis of racism in different contexts into this approach, but I also engage with the works of Hannah Arendt, Frantz Fanon, Achille Mbembe, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, among others. For the purposes of outlining the key contours of a critical phenomenology of migrant deaths, I would like to introduce two fragments from Hannah Arendt's work. The first positing plurality as the basis of our sense of reality in the world, and the second turns attention to the numerous ways in which that shared world can be unmade to the effect of turning some living beings into inanimate corpses. To start with the first fragment, in the first volume of her incomplete and posthumously published work, The Life of the Mind, Arendt introduces a phenomenological understanding of the world as a stage shared by all living things. Let me quote her very briefly. Every living thing depends upon a world that solidly appears as the location for its own appearance, on fellow creatures to play with, and on spectators to acknowledge and recognize its existence, unquote. Being and appearing, often thought to be antithetical in philosophical discourse, coincide for living, embodied, sense-endowed beings, Arendt insists. The appearance of each living thing presupposes a spectator, as living things appear to each other with the anticipation of eliciting from their fellow creatures an acknowledgement of their distinctive appearance. The second fragment is from Arendt's chapter, Race and Bureaucracy, in the second volume of The Origins of Totalitarianism. And this fragment represents the unmaking of the world as an intersubjective space of appearance in many respects. We see here the devastating violence of European overseas imperialism that recognizes no legal and ethical constraints in its pursuit of power and race rule. It renders indigenous populations superfluous according to racial categorizations of humanity, and the European settlers even fail to recognize that their massacres of the indigenous amount to murder. This violent order is maintained by an imperial bureaucracy that operates with absolute lawlessness and justifies the killings of racialized others as a routinized practice in the service of empire. My turn to the second fragment in order to understand migrant deaths as forced disappearances arising from a racialized regime of lethal border enforcement might seem puzzling. After all, Arendt's own Eurocentric assumptions and racist tropes in her account of overseas imperialism had long been noted by critics such as Anne Norton, Jimmy Cassis-Clausen, and Catherine T. Jeans. But thinking with Arendt against Arendt might offer a different interpretive strategy, one that does not gloss over Arendt's Eurocentric moves, but reconsiders how her work simultaneously reproduces and contests Eurocentrism. This bears close resemblance to the interpretive strategy that Edward Said adopts in his analysis of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, the novella that serves as Arendt's key reference in her chapter, Race and Bureaucracy. Reading Conrad as an author simultaneously criticizing and reproducing the imperial ideology of his time, Said foregrounds the critical insights of Heart of Darkness as a work that, quote, dates imperialism, shows its contingency, records its illusions and tremendous violence and waste, unquote. We could make a similar argument about Arendt, even or precisely at those moments when her work reproduces the signature moves of European racism. It also assumes a critical force by foregrounding the violent crimes of a lawless regime that annihilates racialized others with impunity. Let me briefly reflect on how the two fragments from Arendt can allow us to develop a critical phenomenology of migrant deaths. At first sight, the fragments seem to be pulling us in very different directions. The first one, if you recall, posits the intersubjective world of appearances as the very condition of our sense of reality. In that, it seems to pursue the kind of transcendental inquiry associated with Husserlian phenomenology, inquiring into the a priori conditions of possibility for perception as such. The second fragment is much more historical in its orientation, as it alerts us to the conditions under which some human beings cease to appear as human and be expelled from the world of the living. But the two fragments begin to eliminate each other, I think, once we reconsider Arendt as a critical phenomenologist, attending to how the relationship of living things to each other and to the world they inhabit is always already mediated by social norms, historical conditions, and relations of power. Within a racially stratified social order, the field of perception itself is not neutral to the question of race, as it's saturated by racial schemas regulating what can be perceived and how. And here I'm paraphrasing from Butler's analysis of the Rodney King trial, which I think is more helpful than her ontologized account of precariousness for the purpose of rethinking migrant deaths. Let me briefly illustrate how this critical phenomenological framework can help us understand the racialized allocation of vulnerability to death and injury at the borders. I'm going to do this with a brief example from 2014, when 400 migrants from sub-Saharan Africa who attempted to cross the Spanish border in Ceuta, a town near Morocco, and they were shot by fire bullets by the Spanish Guardia Civil on February 6, 2014, rubber bullets. The actions of the Spanish officers led to a chaos at sea, which basically resulted in the death of 15 migrants. The Spanish authorities justified this lethal action by referring to the migrants' belligerent attitude. The legal investigation of the case was dropped because the judge presiding in the case ruled that the circumstances legitimized the use of riot equipment for purposes of border protection. She argued that it was the migrants who placed themselves in harm's way by willingly accepting the risks of illegally entering Spanish territory. In her account of the Boers' encounters with Hottentots, to use the racially charged terms Arendt adopts in her analysis of imperialism, she highlights how the racialized assumptions of European men about the savagery of Africans made it impossible for them to even recognize their killing as murder. To quote her briefly, they were, as it were, natural human beings who lacked the specifically human character, the specifically human reality, so that when European men massacred them, they somehow were not aware that they had committed murder, unquote. Migrants in the Spanish case seem to appear similarly as phantoms, unreal and ghost-like, to quote Arendt, when the judge represents them as belligerent hordes whose own wretchedness drives them desperately to their own deaths at the shores of Europe. The legal sanction on lethal state violence also underscores how lawfulness of a certain kind can be used to justify even the ghastliest atrocities, as Arendt reminded us in several different contexts. The Spanish case should also be situated within the European bureaucratic machinery of border enforcement, which has come to authorize military operations that blur the lines between pushback and rescue, rendering migrants collateral damage in the fight against human smuggling and trafficking, a new iteration of the white man's burden, so to speak. To conclude, a critical phenomenology, as different from an ethical ontological framework of vulnerability, can help us attend much more closely to the elements of this complex legal, political, and socio-historical constellation that has turned borders into racialized regimes of lethal violence. And thinking with Arendt against Arendt can offer crucial resources for developing such an approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayten. Okay, next up, it's my pleasure to introduce Patchen Markell, who's a professor of government at Cornell University. And Patchen will be speaking on the conceits of rule, Aristotle, Arendt, and feminism. Thanks, Patchen.
Thank you, Anna. It's really great to be here today and to see so many friends again. Actually, my title has changed. It's now even more straightforward. It's just called Thinking with and Against as Feminist Political Theory. And I'm not going to try to summarize a long paper today. I'm also not going to talk quite as much as I think I'm supposed to about Hannah Arendt, and certainly not going to forecast the future of Arendt studies, because I wanted to focus instead on the meaning of the phrase that makes up the other half of this panel title, Thinking with and Against, and also to keep in the foreground two things that have been discussed already today by Caroline Emke especially, which are teaching and feminism. And I want to start with a story. In the spring of 1995, Shayla Ben-Habib taught a lecture course to about 100 undergraduates as part of Harvard University's core curriculum. I was one of her teaching assistants at the time. And the course was basically an introduction to Western political theory, organized around the idea of the public-private distinction. The syllabus started with a few weeks on classical Athenian philosophy and literature, paired with Arendt and others. then continued with Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Marx, and Mill, and then concluded with a few weeks on 20th century texts and problems, from Virginia Woolf and Michel Foucault to American jurisprudence about reproductive rights and sexuality. And I have a very vivid memory of a moment in the first third of the semester when Shayla paused to take questions, only to be challenged by a young man. I remember there being a baseball cap, but I might be wrong about this, who complained about Shayla's devotion of so much time, lecture after lecture, to the hierarchical household relationships laid out in the first book of Aristotle's Politics, between parents and children, masters and slaves, husbands and wives, blah, 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 and asked when she was going to get on to the important stuff. Those were not exactly his words, but they capture what I remember of the force and the tone of his comment, with its combination of slouching boredom and entitled indignation. Now, it felt to me like a tense moment, but Shayla's response, which at the time I assumed was improvised, though I think now she was probably familiar with challenges like this, was magnificent. She explained calmly and undefensively that when she had been taught Aristotle's Politics, her teachers had largely passed over these parts of the text as though they were irrelevant to its real subject matter. But that had been bad scholarship. It tacitly reproduced what those readers took to be Aristotle's own wisdom about the stark difference in importance between the affairs of the oikos and those of the polis, and yet conspicuously ignored significant parts of what Aristotle himself had actually said on the subject, and said front and center in book one, not as an aside or as an afterthought. And so when feminist scholars insisted on bringing the constitution of the public-private distinction into the foreground of their readings of Aristotle and other canonical thinkers, this was, of course, a political intervention, but it was also a matter of taking the text, the whole text, seriously, not as an authority, also not as something to be debunked and then discarded, but as a text that, if you read it carefully, could show you something, including probably something more or other than its author had intended, about the tensions and the contradictions that structured the world in which it was written, and our world too. Now, as far as I remember, and as far as my notes show, because of course I kept them and I consulted them when I was working on this, Shayla didn't refer to what she was doing in this course as thinking with and against Aristotle or anybody else. But I begin with this story because I think it might shed some light on that phrase, thinking with and against. And my worry is that that phrase might be too easily reduced, not certainly by Shayla, but by casual listeners, to a matter of learning from someone while also maintaining sufficient independence to disagree with them when appropriate and necessary. Now, obviously, that's part of it. Shayla's own theoretical practice reflects this. In the earliest article of which I'm aware, in which she referred to herself as thinking with Arendt against Arendt, she began to unpack that idea by praising other readers who, in her words, retrieve gems of insight from Arendt's writing, which can still illuminate our struggles as contemporaries. And yet on the flip side, as we all know, Shayla has long criticized Arendt both for her failures of judgment in specific political contexts and on kind of philosophical and meta-theoretical issues, for example, for failing to supply her political theory with proper normative foundations. But if this kind of learning from someone and also maintaining your independence and disagreeing with them when necessary was all there was to it, then thinking with and against might turn out to be nothing more than what another teacher of mine, impatient with what he saw as the excessive piety of Arendt's readers toward their subject, once suggested was the proper way to approach her work, or really the work of any other thinker of the past, by ransacking and pillaging it ruthlessly, hauling away whatever you can use for your own purposes and leaving the rest behind. So, what exactly is the difference between thinking with and against and, let's call it, critical ransacking? What I want to propose today is that we can't fully understand thinking with and against either as a mode of interpretation or as part of a pedagogy unless we take seriously its status as an element of Shaila's practice of feminist political theory. One fact that might seem to speak against this idea is that Shaila explicitly compared thinking with and against to Arendt's not particularly feminist mode of engagement with the political tradition of the West. And yet it's also true that Shaila made this comparison in what was to that point the most explicitly and sustainedly feminist of her essays on Arendt, Feminist Theory and Hannah Arendt's Concept of Public Space, published in 1993. The comparison is worth lingering over. As Shaila had already explained in an earlier piece on the redemptive power of narrative, Arendt's mode of engagement with the tradition was a response to a dilemma. On the one hand, inherited categories of understanding and evaluation had lost their authority as a tradition, and this was not simply because in the concentration camps they had run up against events that defied comprehension. For Arendt, the disconnect between traditional concepts and the political situation of the 20th century had been deepening at least since the First World War. But on the other hand, Shaila wrote, and this is a key sentence for me at least, even when the thread of tradition is broken, even when the past is no longer authoritative simply because it has been, it lives within us and we cannot avoid placing ourselves in relation to it. You might also have a footnote here to the tradition of all the dead generations weighing like a nightmare on the brains of the living. Now, a compounded analog to this dilemma, I think, also animates feminist theory and Hannah Arendt's concept of public space. There, on the one hand, Shaila introduces Arendt as a thinker whom feminists have found infuriatingly hard to think with, not least because her categories of understanding so often seem to be congruent with those of a patriarchal tradition that has in various ways gendered, denigrated, and obscured the labor of social reproduction on which public political life also depends. But on the other hand, Arendt is also a theorist whom feminists should not avoid, and that's because feminists cannot avoid some relation to traditional conceptual formations like the public-private distinction. It's true, one way to relate to such a distinction would be to abandon it altogether, but this, Shaila argued, would be politically catastrophic for a variety of reasons for feminism, and so the only thing left to do, and the imperative that drove her article, was to look more closely at how that formation had been assembled, how that formation had been assembled in Arendt's work and also in the tradition that Arendt herself encountered. This would let you see, for example, how the idea of the private as a space of physical and affective shelter had been conflated with, and so made to seem impossible without the idea of the private as a fundamentally unfree domain of dependent or embodied labor. It would let you see how that conflation has helped sustain the domination of women by men. And it would also help you see where exploitable seams in that assemblage might be showing, both in theory and in the world. Now, I think that the presence of this kind of motivating dilemma marks the first key difference between thinking with and against and critical ransacking. Let me put the point as bluntly as possible. Critical ransacking imagines the contemporary theorist as an individual who ventures out in search of good ideas and finds some, inconveniently heaped together with or bonded to a bunch of bad ideas, and also protected by the guards and walls of established authority. Heroically, using nothing but his own intellect, because this is a quest narrative, keep in mind, and it's a certain model of the accession to philosophical maturity. He dispatches the guards, he batters down the walls, separates the treasure from the dross, and carts it away. We've all had that kid in class. Some of us might have been that kid in class. I apologize. Thinking with and against, by contrast, positions the contemporary theorist as someone caught in a bind, for whom the so-called canonical authors of the past, including the recent past, are no longer authoritative and maybe never were, but who nevertheless remain unavoidable. From this perspective, the violence that the ransacker has to deploy to defeat authority has already taken place. Maybe it was the violence of the break in tradition that Arendt in her essay on Benjamin said had relieved him, Benjamin, of the old-fashioned collector's task of destruction by presenting him with an already ruined world so that he had only to bend over and pick up his fragments. Or maybe it was the violence of the enforcement of gender subordination in the face of women's resistance to it in the name of a differently organized world. A violence and a vision that remain illegible from inside the terms of a tradition that so often simply naturalizes both gender difference and the hierarchy that is supposed to follow from it. But in either case, the result is a situation in which, at least for some readers, as Arendt once put it, the tradition falls silent when we ask our questions, while at the same time, the elements that make up that tradition continue to command attention and carry weight to be unavoidable. And they do this, including in mundane ways, in the dynamics that govern who and what gets taken seriously in the academy and what hoops one has to jump through in order to have a voice there. Arendt was able to make that silence articulate by reading the tradition diagnostically. And I think that thinking with and against, understood as a practice of feminist political theory, does something similar. And I would wager that the affinity between these two situations might be one reason, although certainly not the only reason, that so much of the most innovative and important work in Arendt studies, at least in the time that I've been around, has been done by feminist readers, critics, appropriators, and commentators on Hannah Arendt. But that brings me in conclusion to a second key feature of the practice of thinking with and against, and also back to Shaila's Harvard course. The image of ransacking suggests the priority of the part to the whole from which it is forcibly removed. But the diagnostic approach to reading involved in thinking with and against doesn't. Of course, it's not holist in the strong sense of trying to restore the ruined coherence and the lost authority even of an individual text, much less of an entire corpus or a tradition. But it does insist that some of the most important things those texts can tell us about themselves, about their world, and also about our world, only become visible in the relations, including the tensions and the contradictions between their parts. It is holist in the same way that I think my colleague Jill Frank means when she refers to the practice of looking at everything everywhere in a text, rather than selecting parts that will allow the work or its author to be reduced to an abstractable position in relation to some simplified set of conceptual coordinates. And one of the things that was most compelling to me about Shaila's answer to her impatient student back in 1995, and which really struck me and I think has shaped the way that I think about things in a variety of ways, was the way in which she simultaneously affirmed the specific contemporary feminist perspective from which she was conducting her diagnostic reading of Aristotle at that point, and defended this precisely as a matter of doing justice to the whole text. This productively scrambled the usual assumptions according to which an avowedly political interpretation was presumed to sacrifice faithfulness or objectivity, while on the other hand, careful, patient reading was presumed to go along with political neutrality if you were for it, or ideological docility if you were against it. It was a brilliant move, and it's a move that has been really enabling, I think, for a lot of Shaila's students. It certainly has for me. It was also a move made under pressure, as Shaila, along with many others, navigated the specific dilemmas of doing feminist political theory and feminist philosophy in the midst of disciplines where their questions were often treated as illegible, as they sometimes still are, and of course, they're not the only ones that are. There is always more thinking with and against our fields and their inheritances to be done. And those of us who've studied with Shaila are fortunate both to have been shown a model of how to do it and also to have inhabited an intellectual and professional space in which doing it was made to seem possible, even welcome, and indeed necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Patchen. Okay, so we're going to go to our last speaker for this panel. And I also just want to remind the audience that we'd love to start seeing your questions in the Q&A function so that we can get a few questions in. And we might go a couple minutes over in this panel just so that we make sure we can get some audience feedback. But before we go there, our last speaker is Christian Volk. He's a professor of social sciences at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and he is going to be speaking to us about Hannah Arendt's critique of domination. Thank you, Christian.
Yeah, hello. Thank you, Anna. Hello, Shayla. So good to see you. Thank you very much for the invitation and for giving me the chance to contribute to this wonderful event. The organizers also thank you for all your effort you put in this event. And hello, colleagues. So good to see you. I also have some slides. I'm going to share them with you if it works. Yes. Good. Okay. Some years ago, during a workshop in Hamburg, I had the great opportunity to ask Jürgen Habermas about his memories of Hannah Arendt. You know, he said, when I was growing up, my teachers told me, they indoctrinated us, that Jews and women are only of secondary importance for philosophy. Habermas went on to say that he didn't really believe in these words, but they were there. This was the atmosphere. When I met Arendt, he continued, I realized that all of this talk and all of these stereotypes were a big lie. This little anecdote not just sheds light on the relationship between Arendt and Habermas, a topic of some relevance for Shayla's own work. In response to her critics that she was interpreting Habermas into Arendt, so to say, Shayla turned the matter around, arguing instead that she was showing how Habermas was an Arendtian. Besides this, the little anecdote also touches on the question of how different ways of thinking and experiencing the world in exile influenced intellectual developments on both sides of the Atlantic, another topic that Shayla dealt with extensively. Shayla's Arendt interpretation, though not uncontested, became paradigmatic. We all know this. One of her central achievements certainly was to demonstrate how Arendt's endeavor to recover the public world of politics must be understood as a philosophical project as well. In this vein, she pointed out how Arendt's critique of existential philosophy leads Arendt to a new interpretation of Heidegger's concept of the world. And it is through this critical engagement with Heidegger, as Shayla argues, that Arendt arrives at the core assumption of her philosophical and political thinking, namely that human existence is conditioned by plurality. With a concept of plurality derived in this way, Shayla is able to defend Arendt against the accusation that her criticism of modernity is merely an exaggerated conservative reflex of a thinker lost in Hellenistic nostalgia. Instead, Arendt's critique is shown to be directed against the all-encompassing character of production and consumption processes that endanger the plurality of human forms of existence and the diversity of viewpoints in the world, leading us to wordlessness. In this way, Shayla interprets Arendt as a critical theorist of politics and society. Since my student days, this approach to Arendt's work has been particularly inspiring. So for the remaining time, I would like to say a little bit about what I take to be central to this program of a critical theory of politics and society, namely the Arendtian critique of domination as a way of critically analyzing democratic order. Arendt's thoughts on domination are scattered throughout her work, but the core idea is to conceive of domination as depoliticization. Arendt stresses the interrelationship between domination and depoliticization in her deliberations on the Nazi system of total domination. In her essay, Freiheit und Politik, Freedom and Politics, which only exists in its long and detailed version in the German language, Arendt argues that we completely misunderstand the phenomenon of total domination if we assume that it is concerned with the total politicization of life. Quite the opposite is the case. We are dealing with phenomena of depoliticization, like in all dictatorships and despotism, only that this depoliticization manifests itself in such a radical way that it exterminates the element of political freedom in all activities and is not satisfied just to destroy action, which is the political capacity par excellence, unquote. Later on in this essay, she speaks about depoliticization as the destruction of the political element. One could, of course, argue that Arendt's account merely refers back to her emphatic, normatively charged concept of politics, but I would like to show that it also provides us with an analytical perspective on domination. If we dwell on this notion of political elements, it seems that there are forms of social intercourse in society in and through which people treat each other as free and equals, creatively interact with each other, learn how the world opens up differently for other people, and experience the potential to alter human affairs. Besides arts, theater, literature, or poetry, there are coffee houses, regular tables, discussions among friends, etc., where people can experience these political elements without acting politically in the strict sense of the word. However, for a system of total domination, it is crucial to ban the free flourishing of such forms of interaction in society and even to eliminate them from social and private life with a mixture of terror, secret police, networks of spies and informants, as well as ideology, by generating fear, isolation, solitude, loneliness, and indoctrination. The consequence was that central practices of reproduction of the National Socialist order remain uncontested. This theoretical motif, namely domination as depoliticization, is not restricted to Arendt's analysis of Nazi Germany. With respect to the escalation of the student protests in the 1960s, Arendt tells us On Violence that the dissenters in Eastern Europe, quote, demand free speech and thought as the preliminary conditions for political action, unquote. They were living under a political order that explicitly denied these political rights. In contrast, the students in the West, quote, live under conditions where these preliminaries, that is, rights and institutions, no longer open the channels for action, unquote. This, in her eyes, explains to some extent the radicalization of the student revolt. Arendt only gives us this brief remark, but I would like to pick it up and try to sketch how domination within a democracy could be conceptualized from an Arendtian perspective. From an Arendtian perspective, domination in a democracy reveals itself when rights and institutions cease to open channels for political action. The result is that the central practices of reproduction of exactly this order, this system, remain politically uncontested. The extent to which this is actually realized must be qualified for obvious reasons. Of course, political acting does not disappear completely from public life, not totally, but for large parts of the people living in a democratic system, it is not seen as an option, and they refrain from acting politically. There is a gap between the enabling of political action and the exercise of political action. The consequence of this gap is that the promises of a democratic way of life, entailed in its basic principles such as freedom, equality, justice, solidarity, etc., are not fulfilled for everyone living in such an order to an equal extent, but only for the few. This in turn has negative consequences for the reputation that the promises, the procedures, and the demands of democracy enjoy among the population. If we want to know how this particular type of domination, namely democratic domination, comes into being, we need to carefully analyze how this gap between enabling and occurring, between promise and fulfillment, is produced and reproduced on a daily basis in modern democracies. For example, this gap can be reproduced by maintaining sexual and racialized discrimination combined with a socio-economic basic structure that leads to poverty, isolation, and social alienation, with the effect of political disaffection, disenchantment, disengagement, in other words, non-participation. Likewise, the mediatization of politics turns citizens into consumers and addresses them with political marketing campaigns, reproducing a very narrow interpretation and institutionalization of political participation. Naturally, we could think of many other forms of depoliticization. It is important, however, to stress that these forms of depoliticization do not develop in a vacuum. They are inherently connected to the structural and historical materialization of the idea of democracy and the way we practice democracy today. Citizenship is our ambivalent organizational mechanism for achieving political inclusion and integration. The way we promote the idea of equality is predominantly in legal terms, or take modern democracy's entanglement with capitalism and its devastating realities it generates. This list could go on and on. I'll conclude with a final thought. Manifestations of depoliticization, like the ones I glossed over before, point to how the promises of democracy are not being equally fulfilled. They emanate from a very particular materialization of the idea of democracy and, in turn, engender a political constellation where the contestation of our current practices of democracy is suspended or blocked. This is how a critical analysis of modern democracies, inspired by Arendt's little remark, would look like. And thanks to Shayla, much road has been paved to develop Arendt's ideas in terms of a critical theory of politics in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christian. Okay, so we have a few questions, but I'd love to fit in at least 3, so we'll go just a few minutes over. So much fruitful stuff on this panel. So I'm going to start, and Nika is going to help me by doing the technological background, so I'm just going to speak it into being. So we have a question. I'm going to start with a question from Itamar Mann. And I think that Nika is actually going to unmute you so that you can present your question yourself.
Hello, everyone. This is really an extraordinary panel and event. I'm actually quite stirred by it. I will preface by saying that I encountered Pachin Markel's work in a seminar by Shayla Ben Habib and was very kind of influenced by it when I studied under Professor Ben Habib. But my question is to Ayten Gündüzlü, which is about the framing of migrant deaths as forced disappearances. And I'm wondering what is the, this actually came up recently in advocacy work that I've been involved in with regard to a particular disappearance in Greece of a man, a 25-year-old man an 11-year-old boy who his brother went to search after him and was also disappeared, a 25-year-old man named Fadi. Anyways, the question is, how does this framing help us in terms of struggling against injustice at the borders of Europe? What does it do to our argument? And as I was thinking through this, one option that came up in mind was that it really shifts the rights from the person who was disappeared and cannot exercise them to their family members in a very significant way, and maybe creates different kinds of duties and different duty bearers corresponding to those rights. Also related to family and their rights to access information. And maybe also there's a certain relationship here to the law of inheritance. So these are kind of quite general thoughts, but I was wondering whether you could help me in carrying them a little bit forward and developing them more as you were working on this for a number of years now, I believe. Thank you so much for your beautiful talk as well.
Thank you, Tamar. Thank you so much for that question. And, the term forced disappearance, the way I'm using it, in one sense, I'm taking it from international human rights law, but in another sense, I'm also using it in this phenomenological sense to also think about that law in a critical way. So in some ways, actually, it is to highlight how the existing legal frameworks as they now exist in many ways reenact that forced disappearance, as they offer various forms of justifications for the lethal state violence enacted in the name of border control. But I do also agree with you that it could be used, in legal advocacy to actually maybe address some of these problems or limitations that we see in the existing framework. I'm inspired in some ways by basically the special rapporteur on extrajudicial killings, Agnes Calamar's report, which basically compared these deaths to extrajudicial killings, but also your own work, which pursued that idea. But I also want to basically address this question, this euphemistic term that is used, right? The missing, those who cannot be identified, they are missing. I want to say they were forcefully disappeared by these states. And that I think can also address one of the crucial limitations of existing human rights law, which basically wants to have an identifiable agent to which rights can be attributed, right? And in many cases, basically the state violence and just the forced disappearance is basically making these people unidentifiable in the first place. So I think, yes, it can basically make now families able to press these claims, but I think more broadly, it can also, the broader public can also press these kinds of claims, because once we define it, once we understand it as a state crime, as forced disappearance, it turns it into a crime against humanity, very different from how they are currently being handled.
Thank you so much. I would love to follow up.
Oh.
Yeah, no, not now, but in the future. Thank you so much for this opportunity to ask my question.
Great, thank you. Okay, we also have a question here from Pavel Barkowski. Nika, if you can direct us to him.
You should be unmuted. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, I can speak.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for the brilliant discussion and for this brilliant presentations. But I have a question to anyone who want to answer it. Because of lack of time, I only speak loud what I scribe. Now in Belarus, we see the new level of cruelty, tortures, and violence from the ordinary people who serve the regime. They dehumanize their opponents as fascists because of some ideological patterns associating the historical flag with that was used by collaborators at the period of Second World War. Is it reactivation of Eichmann's phenomenon, as Arendt described in a new way? Or do we have another strategies of violence and biopolitics diverged from the experience of Second World War? And a second question, could we speak about possibility of returning fascism as practice of total dehumanization and radical violence in some new mode? Is it quite important question for Belarus now, because we have such a difficult situation with civil tensions. Thank you very much for the possibility to ask my question.
Thank you. And yeah, I was going to say, Sonali, maybe you could take this one on.
I don't know. Thanks for the question. As I understand, the question is, are we going through a different period of violence that is very different than the Eichmann phenomenon when, for the speakers, brings up the example of Belarus. And I wanted to say that I think what I found through thinking about Eichmann in relation to this other type of violence that happened in Indonesia in the 60s is that both perpetrators in both cases had an element of sort of ideological prejudice or racism that motivated the action. It sounds like in Belarus, the dehumanization of others is doing that work. But there was also a very banal element, and banal I want to use in two ways. One is banal in thinking of the job as part of a bureaucracy, or for trying to make your superior happy, just as you would do in any other position. So something very ordinary about that, but also banal in the place in the human psyche that it engages with both Eichmann and Anwar in Indonesia. They just wanted to be celebrities in their own societies. They wanted fame, they wanted attention, and so the banality is also in that very human need for self-glorification. And it seems like both those elements, the banal and the exceptional, would also be at play in contemporary instances of violence.
Thank you very much, Sonali.
Thank you so much, Sonali. So I wanted to give Shayla an opportunity if she wanted to either ask a question of the panel or maybe make a comment or a response if you're interested. Oh, do we have Shayla, or is she frozen? Okay, I think she may be frozen. So I'm just gonna go, we have another question from Ari Elmeri Huvonen. Nika, maybe you can get Ari into ask the question.
Yeah.
I think she's unmuted you if you'd like to ask the question. Is Ari Elmeri there? No, nothing. Oh, sorry, something's coming up in the, she's having I'm sorry, I don't actually know if it's a he or she, as a mic issue. If you want to type your question here, I can read it out. Oh, you know what, you had it typed, so I can read it out. Or Nika, will you read it for us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. And this question's for Chris.
Yeah. It reads, Chris, you mentioned the quote from Freiheit und Politik, where Arendt says that depoliticization destroys the elements of political freedom in all activities. In the spirit of thinking with Arendt against Arendt, to what extent can this be developed in your mind into a political criticism of relations of domination in the spheres other than the narrowly conceived public sphere, for example, labor relations? So that's for Chris.
Very good question. Yeah, I mean, Patchen rightly pointed out the pitfalls of this phrase, thinking with and against. So maybe it is something like thinking with and beyond Arendt, and include in a critical analysis of modern democracies also the depoliticizing effects of how market economies are structurally organized, and how they alienate people from experiencing them as equals, as people who could alter affairs, who could alter human affairs. And in that regard, I would definitely try to include into a critical theory of politics the spheres of the fear of the economy and how it is organized and how it could enhance or disable necessary democratic experiences.
Great. Okay, so it looks like Shayla had wanted to ask a question, but we seem to have some technical difficulties and lost her. So I'm going to use my executive privilege, and what I'm going to do is say, let's go on break, and I'm going to give Shayla she may want to respond though to this panel later in her comments, and so hopefully you guys will all be back at that time, so that if there's any kind of leftover conversation we can do it there. But this was just wonderful to get such an amazing group of Arendt scholars together all at once. Is pretty exciting for me, and I really enjoyed all of this. So to everybody out there, we are going to send you off for a 10-minute break, and we reconvene at, I don't know what time is it on the East Coast, at 2:45 p.m. For our panel number 3, the last panel, Struggles for Dignity in Adversity and Deprovincializing the Post-National Constellation. So if everyone can join me in thanking the panelists on the Thinking With and Against Arendt. And yeah, thank you guys so much, and looking forward to the next panel coming up.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.